Dear viewers, if you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or humiliated by someone who thought they knew your worth, this story is for you. Today you will discover why the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous one to cross, why betrayal always finds its way back to the betrayer, and why dignity in silence is the most powerful response to cruelty. Watch every scene carefully, because every twist carries a life lesson. Drop in the comments what you learned and what you would have done in her shoes. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this. No one in that luxury hospital knew, not the head surgeon, not the admissions director, not the security team stationed at the lobby entrance, that the woman sitting alone in the corridor, counting contractions on her phone, pressing her back against a cold plastic chair, it was the one who had purchased this entire building. She was a secret trillionaire, and she was unaware, in the truest sense of that word, of just how precisely her secret was about to become the most devastating weapon in the room. Not because she planned it that way, but because the universe had a perfect, terrible, surgical sense of timing. She had just bought this luxury hospital, acquired it as part of a larger portfolio restructuring managed entirely by her private legal team, 387 days ago. She had never visited it, had never walked its floors, had no idea that this would be the hospital where her child decided to arrive, had no idea that it would also be the hospital to which her husband, the man lying beside her every night for 5 years, would bring his mistress for a headache on the same night. His mistress had a headache, and he had brought her to the finest, most expensive luxury hospital in the city, the same building, the same floor, as if the universe had arranged every coordinate of this collision with deliberate, merciless precision. She saw them the moment they walked in. Her husband, one hand pressing lightly on the mistress's lower back, his posture relaxed, his expression unbothered, and the woman beside him, whose headache apparently required a $60,000 private suite, and a man who had stopped answering his pregnant wife's calls at 7 p.m. He saw her too, sitting there in the corridor, in labor, alone. And instead of the collapse of a guilty man finally caught, instead of the desperate scramble of someone who understood what he had done, he straightened his shoulders, walked forward. He reached the hospital bed she had been directed to, looked at his pregnant wife directly in the eyes, and told her to move. He kicked his pregnant wife off the hospital bed to seat his mistress first, for a headache, while nurses stood frozen and every person in that ward became a silent, helpless witness to one of the most staggering acts of public cruelty a husband could commit against a laboring wife, and his mother, unseated, composed, watching her son with the quiet pride of a woman who had trained him to behave exactly this way, did not intervene. When his pregnant wife cried out through a contraction, when her body bent under the wave of pain, his mother laughed at her contractions. Clear, audible, intentional. But what she did when his mother laughed, what this secret trillionaire, this overlooked, dismissed, an underestimated woman did in that moment, crushed him so completely and left him devastated in front of every witness in that building. Because what none of them knew, what he had never bothered to ask, what his mother had never thought to discover, was that she had just bought the luxury hospital his mistress was admitted to. And the people now walking through those corridor doors at her summons answered to no one else. What happens when the most powerful woman in the room has been sitting in the corridor in silence the whole time? What did she do that left him so devastated he couldn't speak? And when the truth of who she really was finally hit him, was there anything left to save? Dear viewers, everything you just read was only the beginning. The real story, the betrayal that runs deeper than one night, the secret that is bigger than one hospital, and the moment that finally breaks the man who thought he was untouchable, is still ahead. This story will not just entertain you, it will show you what real strength looks like when it has been pushed to its absolute limit. Stay until the very last word, because that is where the most powerful lesson lives. Drop in the comments what you are thinking right now, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. The contractions had been coming every 6 minutes for the past 2 hours, but Eleanor Whitfield had stopped timing them with panic and started timing them with the quiet, methodical precision of a woman who had learned, very early in life, that falling apart was a luxury she could rarely afford. She sat in the corridor of Meridian Grace Hospital, the finest medical facility in the city, 42 floors of polished marble, soft lighting, and the kind of hushed efficiency that only existed where serious money had been spent. And she pressed her back against the plastic chair with the careful stillness of someone trying not to draw attention to her own suffering. Her go-bag sat between her feet. She had packed it herself 3 weeks ago, folding each item with the tender anticipation of a woman who had waited 5 years for this moment. A white onesie with a small bear embroidered on the pocket. A card her mother had written before she passed. A single photograph of her grandmother, the woman who had looked at a young Eleanor across a mahogany desk 18 months ago and said, "Everything I built for someone worthy of carrying it. That is you." Eleanor had not fully understood what that meant until the attorneys called 6 weeks later. But tonight, sitting in this corridor, she was not thinking about attorneys or blind trusts or the staggering sum of zeros that lived quietly behind her name in documents she rarely opened. She was thinking about the fact that her husband Dalton had not answered her third call. She was thinking about the way the nurse at the admissions desk had processed her with the detached efficiency of someone checking in a parcel. She was thinking about how the overhead lights in this corridor were slightly too bright and slightly too cold, and how she wished, more than anything, that there was one person sitting beside her. There was not. She had called Dalton at 6:47 p.m., when the contractions were still 12 minutes apart, and she had enough composure to keep her voice steady. He had answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying that particular texture of distraction that she had learned to recognize over the past 8 months. The texture of a man whose attention was divided between the person on the phone and something or someone in the room with him. "I'm on my way," he had said. "Traffic is bad. Just get checked in. I'll be there." She had believed him because 5 years of marriage had not yet fully extinguished the instinct to believe him. And because the alternative, the thing she had been quietly suspecting for 8 months but had never allowed herself to name out loud, was a weight she was not ready to carry on top of everything else. But Dalton was not in traffic. At the precise moment Eleanor was being directed to the shared ward on the 3rd floor, Dalton Whitfield was pulling his silver car to a smooth stop at the main entrance of Meridian Grace Hospital, stepping out with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own authority in any room he entered, and opening the passenger door for a woman named Cassandra Reeves. Cassandra had a headache. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to her right temple as she stepped out of the car, her coat perfectly tailored, her boots clicking against the hospital's entrance tiles with the deliberate rhythm of a woman who understood that every entrance was a performance. She was not in distress. She was in costume. But Dalton guided her through those doors with both hands, one at her back, one briefly touching her arm, with more visible tenderness than he had shown his laboring wife in the last 3 months combined. The admissions nurse processed Cassandra Reeves with a private suite request and a credit card that Dalton placed on the counter without hesitation. It was the same counter where, 40 minutes earlier, Eleanor had quietly asked if there were any private rooms available, and been told with a practiced smile that the shared ward was the only option without prior reservation. Dalton had not made a prior reservation for his wife. He had, Eleanor would later discover, made one for Cassandra 2 days ago. The shared ward on the 3rd floor had 4 beds separated by pale curtains. Eleanor had been placed in the bed nearest the window. The best position in the room, the nurse had said, with a kindness that felt genuine. She had settled into it carefully, arranging the thin blanket across her legs, and had just reached for her phone to try Dalton one more time when the curtain at the ward entrance shifted, and Dalton walked in. He was not alone. The contraction hit Eleanor at exactly that moment, a wave so powerful it compressed every coherent thought she had into a single, white-hot point of physical focus. And when it released and her vision cleared and she could see again, she saw her husband standing at the entrance of her ward with his mistress on his arm, while looking at the bed Eleanor was sitting on with the calm, assessing expression of a man making a logistical decision. His mother, Vivian Whitfield, rose from the chair in the corner where she had been sitting so silently that Eleanor had not even registered her presence. Vivian straightened her jacket, said nothing. but the look she exchanged with her son carried the entire conversation in less than 2 seconds. Dalton walked to Eleanor's bed. He did not ask how she was. He did not look at her with guilt or apology or the bare minimum of human acknowledgement that the situation demanded. He looked at her the way a man looks at an inconvenient obstacle, something to be moved efficiently and without sentiment. And he said in a voice so low that only Eleanor and Vivian could hear it clearly, "Cassandra needs to lie down. Her head is killing her. You can sit in the chair." Eleanor stared at him. Another contraction was already building. She could feel it gathering at the base of her spine like a storm front, still 30 seconds away but coming fast. And in the space between that gathering and that breaking, she looked at the man she had married, the man whose child she was hours away from delivering, and she understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful that she had been wrong about him for a very long time. She did not move fast enough. Dalton reached past her, gripped the bed rail, and with one firm, decisive gesture, shifted the position of the bed away from her, angling it toward Cassandra, clearing the space, making the transfer of occupancy unmistakable in public. He had kicked his pregnant wife off the hospital bed to seat his mistress first. The nurse at the station 3 feet away had gone completely still. The woman in the bed across the ward had stopped reading her magazine, and Vivian Whitfield, watching her daughter-in-law grip the window ledge as the contraction finally arrived in full force, watching her bend forward, watching the involuntary sound escape her that no woman should ever have to make alone, covered her mouth. Not in horror, in laughter. It was a small sound, but it was a deliberate one, and it landed on Eleanor like something physical, like something that left a mark. Eleanor straightened, slowly. The contraction ebbed. She released the window ledge. She turned and looked at Vivian, really looked at her, with eyes that had just finished grieving something and were now completely, utterly clear. And she reached into her go bag. She pulled out her phone, and she scrolled to a contact that had no name, only a symbol, a small crown. She pressed call. The phone rang twice, just twice, and then a voice answered that was not the voice of a receptionist, not the voice of an assistant, not the voice of anyone who needed to be told twice what to do. It was the voice of a man named Gerald Holt, 63 years old, 22 years in private wealth management, a man who had navigated the financial architecture of 3 generations of the Whitfield Ashworth fortune with the quiet precision of a surgeon who never once left a scar where it wasn't intended. Eleanor spoke 4 words. "Gerald, I am here." There was a pause, not the pause of confusion, but the pause of a man rapidly recalibrating every variable in a situation he had not anticipated but was entirely equipped to handle. Then Gerald said, "What?" in the measured tone of someone who had spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this kind of moment. "I understand. Give me 8 minutes." Eleanor ended the call. She slipped the phone back into her go bag. She lowered herself into the chair beside the window, the chair her husband had relegated her to so that his mistress could occupy her bed. And she folded her hands in her lap with the stillness of a woman who had just set something irreversible into motion and was now simply waiting for it to arrive. Dalton was not watching her. He was adjusting the pillow behind Cassandra's head, speaking to her in a low, solicitous murmur, his hand resting on the bed rail with the proprietary ease of a man who had entirely forgotten or entirely stopped caring that his wife was 4 feet away and in active labor. Vivian had resettled into her corner chair. She had produced a compact mirror from her handbag and was touching up her lipstick with the serene concentration of a woman attending a social event rather than a maternity ward. She caught Eleanor's reflection in the compact mirror once, just once, and the look she offered was not malice exactly. It was something colder than malice. It was dismissal, the particular dismissal of a woman who had decided years ago that her son's wife was a temporary inconvenience that had simply taken longer than expected to resolve itself. Eleanor had known about Vivian's feelings for 4 years. She had known from the first Christmas dinner when Vivian had looked at the modest bracelet Dalton had given Eleanor and said with a smile as thin as paper, "How sweet. He always did have simple taste in accessories." She had known from the family photographs that Vivian arranged and rearranged on the mantelpiece, Eleanor, always at the edge, always slightly cropped, always positioned as though she had wandered into the frame by accident. She had known from the way Vivian spoke about Cassandra Reeves at family gatherings, before Eleanor had even confirmed the woman existed. A remarkable woman, really, the kind who understands what a man like Dalton actually needs. With the particular enthusiasm of a mother who had already chosen her son's next wife and was simply waiting for the current one to receive the memo. Eleanor had never responded to any of it, not because she was weak, but because she had inherited, along with her grandmother's fortune, her grandmother's most fundamental philosophy, that the most powerful response to a person who underestimates you is to let them continue doing so, right up until the moment it is no longer useful. That moment, Eleanor had decided 4 seconds after Vivian laughed at her contractions, had arrived. The next contraction came at the 7-minute mark. Eleanor breathed through it alone, one hand pressed flat against the window glass, her eyes focused on the city lights below, and it was during this contraction, during the 38 seconds it took to crest and recede, that she became aware of a shift in the atmosphere of the floor outside the ward. It was subtle at first. The particular change in air pressure that happens when people who are accustomed to authority enter a space, and the people already in that space unconsciously rearrange themselves around the new hierarchy. She heard it before she saw it, the different quality of footsteps in the corridor, the swift, low exchange of voices that carried the cadence of instruction rather than conversation, the sound of a door opening with more purpose than doors in hospital corridors usually opened. And then Gerald Holt walked into the ward. He was not alone. He was flanked by 2 people, a woman in a charcoal suit carrying a leather portfolio, and a man in a dark blazer whose hospital identification badge was different from every other badge Eleanor had seen that evening. Different color, different weight, and the kind of badge that opened doors that other badges didn't. Gerald was 63 years old and looked every year of it. Silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that inspired immediate, involuntary trust. But he moved through that ward with the authority of a man who had just remembered, or perhaps simply announced, that he owned the building, which technically his client did. He crossed the ward in 12 steps. He stopped in front of Eleanor. He looked at her, at the chair she was sitting in, at the hospital bed 4 feet away where another woman was reclining with theatrical discomfort, at the man standing beside that bed who had just turned around with the startled expression of someone who had not expected company. And Gerald's face communicated, in the span of a single second, at everything that needed to be communicated before a single word was spoken. Then he turned to the nurse who had followed him in, the same nurse who had stood frozen at the station when Dalton removed Eleanor from her bed. And he said in a voice that was perfectly calm and absolutely final, "Please prepare the executive suite on the 38th floor for Mrs. Whitfield immediately. Full obstetric team. Dr. Anita Carver is to lead. She is already on her way up." The nurse did not hesitate. She did not ask for clarification. She did not look at Dalton for confirmation. She nodded once and left the ward at a pace that was not quite running, but was everything just short of it. Dalton had turned fully around now. His hand had dropped from the bed rail. His expression had moved through several stages in rapid succession. Confusion, on irritation, the particular indignation of a man whose authority has been casually overridden in a space he considered his, and he settled on the version of himself that had always worked in boardrooms and family dinners, and every situation where he needed to reestablish dominance quickly. He drew himself up to his full height. "Excuse me," he said, directing the words at Gerald with the clipped precision of a man who expected immediate deference. "Who exactly are you, and why are you issuing instructions to staff in my wife's ward?" Gerald looked at Dalton Whitfield with the patient, faintly sorrowful expression of a man watching someone walk confidently toward a cliff he cannot yet see. "My name is Gerald Holt," he said. "I am the executive trustee and legal representative of the Ashworth Whitfield Private Foundation, which, as of 14 months ago, holds full controlling interest in Meridian Grace Hospital and its parent company, Meridian Health Group." He paused. "Let that land. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield," he continued, "is the sole beneficiary and principal owner of that foundation." The ward was absolutely silent. Dalton's expression did not collapse immediately. It went through a strange, slow process. like a building whose load-bearing walls have been removed, but whose facade is still standing through sheer architectural memory, holding its shape for a few seconds longer than physics should allow, before the inevitable. Vivian had lowered her compact mirror. Cassandra had stopped performing her headache, and Eleanor, from her chair beside the window, looked at her husband for a long, steady moment, looked at the man who had moved her from her bed, who had brought another woman to her hospital, who had stood beside her for 5 years and never once thought to ask what she was carrying beneath her silence. And she said quietly and without heat, "Gerald, please have Ms. Reeves discharged from the premises. She came in for a headache." She stood, smoothed her maternity dress, picked up her go-bag. "Dalton," she said, as she moved toward the door with Gerald and his team forming a quiet perimeter around her. "Your mother laughed at my contractions." She did not say it with anger. She said it the way a person records a fact, clearly, permanently, for the benefit of anyone listening. "Remember that," she said, "because I will." And she walked out of that ward, out of that bed, out of that corner, out of the version of herself that had been sitting quietly in chairs that were beneath her for 5 years. And she did not look back once. The elevator doors opened on the 38th floor, and Eleanor stepped into a world that was so different from the corridor she had just left that it felt, for a moment, like stepping between two entirely separate realities, separated not by floors, but by the full, staggering distance between who she had been pretending to be and who she actually was. The executive suite level of Meridian Grace Hospital had been designed by the same architectural firm that had built 3 of the most celebrated private medical facilities in Europe. The floors were a warm Italian marble, the lighting was amber and deliberate, and the air carried the faint, clean scent of eucalyptus that came from a ventilation system that had cost more to install than most people earned in a decade. There were fresh flowers on the console table beside the elevator. White peonies in a crystal vase, replaced every morning regardless of whether anyone was present to see them. Eleanor had paid for those flowers technically without ever knowing they existed. Dr. Anita Carver was already waiting at the suite entrance. 51 years old, the most decorated obstetric specialist in the city, a woman whose reputation had been built over 26 years of delivering children into the world with the kind of focused, unhurried excellence that money could access but could not manufacture. She had received Gerald's call 11 minutes ago. She had been in the hospital already, finishing rounds on the floor below, and she had made her way up with the composed urgency of a professional who understood that some situations simply required her to be present. She took one look at Eleanor, at the tightness around her eyes, the careful way she was holding her body, the go-bag hanging from her shoulder like a quiet testament to how alone she had been all evening. And she said nothing about the circumstances that had brought her here. She simply placed one hand briefly on Eleanor's arm and said, "You are in the right place now. Everything from here is taken care of." It was 11 words, but they were the first 11 words anyone had spoken to Eleanor that entire evening that had been directed entirely at her well-being, without agenda, without performance, and without the complicated weight of someone else's priorities pressing beneath them. And Eleanor felt them land somewhere deep and necessary. She nodded once, allowed herself to be guided inside. The suite was extraordinary. A full private room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a medical setup that was indistinguishable from a 5-star hotel room until you looked closely and saw the quiet, precise machinery of world-class obstetric care, arranged with elegant discretion around the perimeter. There was a chair, a real chair, wide and cushioned, positioned beside the bed. Not a plastic corridor chair. Not a chair someone had relegated her to so another woman could take her place. A chair that was there because someone had anticipated that she might want to sit beside her own child after the birth. So Eleanor set her go-bag on the bedside table. She took out the white onesie with the small bear on the pocket. She set it where she could see it. Then she took out her grandmother's photograph. The woman who had built an empire quietly, who had lived simply despite extraordinary wealth, who had told Eleanor once, across a mahogany desk, with the particular gravity of a woman who knew she was running out of time to say the things that mattered, "The money is the least of what I am leaving you." What I am leaving you is the proof that a woman who is underestimated has a weapon that no one can disarm, because no one thinks to look for it. Eleanor had not understood it then. She understood it now, completely. In the way that certain truths only become clear once you have lived through the exact experience they were designed to prepare you for. 3 floors below, the 3rd floor shared ward had become a very different kind of theater. Dalton Whitfield had not moved for 40 seconds after Eleanor walked out. He had stood in the center of that ward, beside the bed he had cleared for his mistress, in front of the nurse's station, where 2 staff members were very carefully not looking at him, under the fluorescent lights that had suddenly lost all their flattering quality. And he had processed in real time the full architecture of what had just happened. His wife owned this hospital, not partially, not as a minor investor, fully, completely. The building he was standing in, the floor beneath his feet, the bed he had just commandeered for another woman, all of it belonged to Eleanor. Had belonged to Eleanor for 14 months. While he was conducting his affair with the particular arrogance of a man who believed his wife was too simple, too grateful, too dependent to ever surprise him, she had been the silent principal owner of one of the most valuable medical assets in the city. The realization did not arrive gently. It arrived the way structural failures arrive. Not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a series of small, sequential surrenders, each one revealing the next, until the full weight of what had been holding everything up was suddenly, catastrophically visible in its absence. He turned to Vivian. His mother was sitting very still. The compact mirror had been returned to her handbag. Her lipstick was perfect. What about her face? The face that had watched Eleanor's contractions with amusement, the face that had spent 4 years arranging family photographs with Eleanor at the edges, had undergone a transformation that Dalton had never seen in 51 years of knowing her. Vivian Whitfield, who had never in her adult life been in a room where she was not the most strategically positioned person present, looked for the first time like someone who had made a catastrophic miscalculation. "Did you know?" Dalton said. It was not a question delivered with anger. It was delivered with the hollow, weightless quality of a man standing in the rubble of something he had built with his own hands. Vivian said nothing. Cassandra, who had been sitting up in the bed with the progressive discomfort of a woman whose performance had lost its audience, swung her legs over the side and reached for her coat. Her headache apparently had resolved. "I think I should go," she said. "Yes," said the nurse at the station, without looking up from her screen. "You should." On the 38th floor, Eleanor breathed through her next contraction with Dr. Carver beside her. Not alone, not in a corridor, not in a chair that someone had assigned to her as a consolation. And when it passed, she looked out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows and thought about her grandmother. She thought about the woman who had built everything quietly, who had never once raised her voice to announce her power, because she had understood that the most unassailable power was the kind that announced itself only when it needed to. She thought about the mahogany desk and the thin afternoon light and the words that had seemed, at the time, like the philosophical musings of a brilliant but fading woman. And she understood now that they had been instructions, precise, loving, perfectly timed instructions for exactly this moment. Gerald knocked softly and entered. He was carrying a single document in a leather folder, the kind of folder that contained things that could not be undone once signed. He set it on the table beside Eleanor's go bag without a word, and Eleanor looked at it and then looked at him. "The Foundation's legal team is ready," Gerald said quietly, "whenever you are." Eleanor looked at the document, then at her grandmother's photograph, then at the city below, at the lights that stretched in every direction, at the world that had been quietly, patiently waiting for her to decide what kind of woman she was going to be from this night forward. Another contraction began to build, but this time Eleanor did not grip a window ledge or a corridor railing. She sat in the wide cushioned chair beside her bed, pressed her feet flat against the warm marble floor, and breathed with the steady, grounded confidence of a woman who had just remembered something essential about herself. She was a secret trillionaire. She owned this hospital. Her child was almost here. And the man who had moved her from her bed to seat his mistress, the man whose mother had laughed at her pain, was 3 floors below her, standing in the ruins of every assumption he had ever made about who she was. She reached for the document. She picked up the pen, and she signed her name, her full name. Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield, the name she had quietly set aside 5 years ago in the warmth of a marriage she had believed in. With the calm, unhurried certainty of a woman who was not ending something. She was beginning it. Eleanor Ashworth Whitfield's daughter arrived at 11:47 p.m. She came into the world on the 38th floor of a hospital her mother owned, delivered by the finest obstetric specialist in the city, in a room filled with the kind of quiet, focused care that asked nothing in return and offered everything it had. She arrived without fanfare, without announcement, without the complicated theater of people who had not earned the right to be present, pretending that they had. And when Dr. Carver placed her in Eleanor's arms for the first time, still wrapped in the soft warmth of her first minutes of existence, Eleanor looked down at her daughter's face and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Complete. Not the fragile, conditional completeness of a woman who has arranged her wholeness around another person's presence, but the deep, structural completeness of someone who has returned, after a long and disorienting journey, to the truth of who they are. She held her daughter against her chest and felt the weight of her, the perfect, specific, irreplaceable weight of this particular child, this particular moment, and she made a promise that she did not speak aloud because it did not need to be spoken. It only needed to be meant. You will never sit in a chair that is beneath you. Not once. Not ever. Not while I am alive. Gerald had stepped out to make the necessary calls. The document Eleanor had signed was already with the Foundation's legal team. A document that, by morning, she would initiate a restructuring of the Ashworth Whitfield Foundation's philanthropic arm that would redirect a significant portion of its annual endowment toward maternal health care funding, specifically targeting hospitals in underserved communities where women in labor sat alone in corridors on plastic chairs because no one had thought to provide better. It was not a revenge decision. It was a clarity decision, the kind that only becomes possible once you have lived through the exact thing you are trying to prevent for someone else. Eleanor had thought of it during her third contraction on the 38th floor, while looking at the city below, and had told Gerald with the matter-of-fact calm of a woman issuing a directive she had been building toward for years without knowing it. Dalton Whitfield had been sitting in the third-floor corridor for 2 hours, not in a plastic chair, though the irony of that would not occur to him until much later, in the weeks of sleepless nights that followed this one. He was sitting on a bench near the elevator, in the particular posture of a man whose body has registered a shock that his mind is still refusing to fully process. His jacket was draped over his knees. His phone was in his hand, but the screen was dark. He had called Eleanor twice, once immediately after Gerald left the ward, once 40 minutes later. And both times the call had gone to a voicemail that did not have his wife's voice on it, but Gerald Holt's, calm and precise. You have reached the office of the Ashworth Whitfield Foundation. Please leave a message. He had not left a message either time. Vivian was seated beside him. She had not spoken in 90 minutes, which was, in Dalton's entire 51 years of knowing her, completely without precedent. Vivian Whitfield had an opinion about everything. About the weather, about other people's furniture, about the nutritional choices of strangers in supermarkets. And the silence coming from her now was not the silence of a woman who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a woman who had said too much, too long, in the wrong direction, and was now sitting in the full consequence of that miscalculation with nowhere comfortable to put her eyes. Cassandra had left the hospital 40 minutes ago. She had walked out of the third-floor ward without looking at Dalton, which told him, with the particular clarity of an action that requires no translation, everything he needed to know about the architecture of what he had believed they had together. She had not called. He had not expected her to. She owned it, Dalton said finally, to no one in particular. She owned it the whole time. Vivian said nothing. 14 months, he continued, with the hollow quality of a man narrating his own devastation as a way of trying to make it real. She owned this hospital for 14 months. She sat in that ward, in that chair, and she never said a word. Dalton, Vivian began. You laughed. The words landed between them like something dropped from a great height. Vivian closed her mouth. Dalton turned and looked at his mother, really looked at her, and with the particular vision that only arrives when every comfortable illusion has been simultaneously removed. And what he saw was not the formidable, strategically brilliant woman he had spent his life trying to impress. What he saw was a woman who had laughed at a laboring daughter-in-law in a hospital ward, in front of nurses and witnesses, because she had miscalculated so completely and so catastrophically the identity of the person she was dismissing that the laughter was going to follow her for the rest of her life. "She is going to remember that," Dalton said. "She told us she would." At midnight, Gerald returned to the 38th floor suite with two things: a cup of tea he had sourced from the executive kitchen, and the news that the Foundation's legal team had already begun preparing the secondary documentation Eleanor had requested during their brief conversation 2 hours ago. Eleanor was nursing her daughter when he entered. She looked up, and Gerald set the tea on the table beside her, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 22 years anticipating needs before they were expressed, and he said, "He is downstairs. He has been there for some time." Eleanor looked at her daughter, at the small, perfect face, at the bear on the white onesie she had folded 3 weeks ago with the tender anticipation of a woman who had not yet known how the night would unfold, but had packed for it anyway, with love, because that was the kind of woman she was. "Gerald," she said, "what did my grandmother do when my grandfather underestimated her?" Gerald was quiet for a moment. He had known Margaret Ashworth for 19 years before her death, and the answer to this question was not simple, but it was clear, and it was the kind of answer that deserved to be given without embellishment. "She built something so significant," Gerald said, "that the underestimation became the most expensive mistake he ever made. Not because she wanted to punish him, but because she refused to let it define the ceiling of what she was capable of." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Tell him," she said, "that he can come up." Gerald paused just briefly. "Are you certain?" "Yes," Eleanor said, "but tell him to come alone. Not his mother. Not anyone else. Just him." Dalton stepped out of the elevator onto the 38th floor at 12:17 a.m., and the first thing he registered was the difference. The marble, the peonies, the amber light, the air that carried the scent of eucalyptus, and the contrast with where he had spent the last 2 hours was so complete and so deliberate that it felt like an argument made entirely through architecture. Eleanor was sitting in the wide cushioned chair when he entered, their daughter asleep against her chest, the city spread out behind her through the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a statement about scale and perspective. She did not look up immediately when he came in. She finished what she was doing, adjusting the edge of the white onesie, very carefully, with the focused tenderness of a woman for whom this moment was the only thing in the room that mattered. And then she looked at him. Dalton Whitfield had walked into a great many rooms in his life with confidence. He had built a career on the ability to enter spaces and immediately recalibrate them around his own authority, to stand in a way that communicated ownership, capability, the easy assurance of a man who had never seriously doubted his position in any hierarchy he inhabited. But standing in the entrance of that suite, looking at his wife in that chair with their daughter asleep on her chest, he had nothing. No recalibration was possible. No authority existed to assert. The hierarchy in this room had been established long before he arrived, and it had nothing to do with confidence or posture or the practiced ease of a man accustomed to being deferred to. It had to do with who she was, who she had always been, who he had never once thought to ask about. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Eleanor, her name is Margaret," Eleanor said quietly, "after my grandmother." Dalton looked at the child, at the small face, the bear on the onesie, the extraordinary ordinariness of a new person who had arrived into the world with no knowledge of the wreckage surrounding her debut and no investment in any of it. Something in his face broke open then, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of a man performing remorse, but with the quiet, structural surrender of someone who has finally, irreversibly, understood the full weight of what they have done and found it unbearable. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't," Eleanor said. "That was never the point." She looked at him steadily, with eyes that had finished grieving, that had moved through every stage of what this night had asked of them and come out the other side into something cleaner and more honest than anything she had felt in years. The point, she said, was that it should not have mattered. Who I am should not have been the reason you treated me with dignity. You should have treated me with dignity because I was your wife, because I was carrying your child, because I was a person in the worst hours of her night, and you were the one person I had the right to expect beside me. Dalton had no answer for this. There was no answer for it. It was simply completely, devastatingly true. And it crushed him in the way that only the truth can crush a person, not with noise or violence, but with the quiet. An irresistible weight of something that cannot be argued with or negotiated around or reframed into something more comfortable. He stood in the ruins of it, left him devastated in the truest sense, not destroyed by her power, not undone by her wealth, but broken open by the simplicity and the justice of what she had said. Eleanor looked down at Margaret, at the small, sleeping face of a child who would grow up knowing exactly who her mother was. "You can see her," Eleanor said softly. "She deserves to know her father. But Dalton, she also deserves to know what it looks like when a person knows their worth." "So do I." She reached for the tea Gerald had left beside her. She lifted it. She looked out at the city, at the lights, at the scale of it. At the world that was still turning with complete indifference to the wreckage of one night in one hospital ward and the quiet, extraordinary rebuilding that was already underway on the 38th floor. "Good night," she said, and Dalton Whitfield walked back to the elevator, pressed the button for the third floor, and stood in the descending silence with the full, irreversible knowledge of what he had lost. Not the trillionaire, not the hospital, not the empire, but the woman. The specific, irreplaceable, extraordinary woman who had loved him simply and completely and asked for nothing more than to be seen. He had not seen her, and now he had to live in the permanent, devastating clarity of understanding exactly what that had cost him. Dear viewers, you just watched a woman who was overlooked, humiliated, and dismissed in her most vulnerable moment, and you watched her respond not with revenge, but with dignity, clarity, and the quiet power of a person who finally chose herself. The lesson here is simple, but life-changing. Never mistake someone's silence for weakness, never confuse their patience for ignorance, and never treat a person's vulnerability as an opportunity to humiliate them. Drop in the comments the biggest lesson you learned from Eleanor's story and what you would have done differently if you were in her shoes. Subscribe for more powerful and educative stories like this.